On Saturday, March 22nd, 2025, members of the Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable traveled to Marion, Arkansas to visit the Sultana Disaster Museum. The Sultana Disaster Museum is in the process of building a new museum building. Actually, they have taken a gymnasium built in 1939 and are converting it into their new high-tech museum with a projected grand opening of April 2026. The Sultana Disaster Museum was chosen to be the 2024 preservation project of the Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable. At the beginning of each of our meetings, we pass around the battlefield bucket and encourage our members to drop in a donation. In 2024, we were able to raise $2,345 for the Sultana. We picked this particular Saturday to deliver the check because the museum was hosting a lecture by Jerry Potter titled The Alabama Connection with the Sultana Disaster. Mr. Potter is an attorney from Memphis, Tennessee, and is the author of The Sultana Tragedy, America's Greatest Maritime Disaster. He has been doing research for over 40 years on this often overlooked historic event. Here now is that lecture and our roundtable's check presentation to the museum.
Well, thanks everybody for coming over today on this beautiful day here in Marion, Arkansas. We're competing with the weather and a Razorbacks game. The last time I checked, it was close, so we hopefully they can pull through. I'm Jeff Kolath, Executive Director of the Sultana Disaster Museum, and can say that after over 20 years of putting on museum programs, this is the first time I've put on a museum program for the Sultana Disaster Museum. So I'm excited to be here with y'all today. Here in this wonderful facility here in Marion, and thanks to Father Horace Tipton for letting us use his space and leaving the door unlocked for us this afternoon and able to set up here in your sanctuary. It's the only church that I've been in, and when I met with him, and I'm sure some of you locals, if I say this wrong, will correct me, but so much of the woodwork out here is from the old Crawfordsville High School, and it's made out of Cuban mahogany, which is absolutely amazing. It's the old gym, wood in the gym, so. Which also is fitting, considering that we've salvaged a ton of wood from the gym down the street that we'll be moving into later this year, and then of course opening our galleries in April 2026 for the new Sultana Disaster Museum. So we'll see if you went to Marion High School and you did some things in that gym, you'll see a lot of bleachers and other wood that's been salvaged and saved, and we're super excited to bring that to everybody. So we'll get started here, and very excited to have some friends from the Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable come up today, Alan and his group. Thank you guys so much for coming up and seeing us today. And they came all the way up from Huntsville, Alabama area, so we decided to put on a little program for them. And who better to invite and have speak really is I think of him as the OG Sultana historian, and that's Mr. Jerry Potter. And Jerry is a Tennessee native and is somebody who has been telling the story of the Sultana and researching it for close to 50 years at this point. 40 for sure. So, but approaching 50. How about that? Yeah. There you go. Approaching 50 years, but someone that is on our board, and along with Gene Saliker and other folks that have researched this story and have tried to tell it in a way that's not just engaging, not just accurate, but really puts the stories of the individuals who are on the boat at the forefront. And that's one of the things about this story, about the Sultana story, about what we're going to do at this new museum, that really is so incredible. It's going to be a people-centric story. It's going to be a people-focused story. And Jerry has a really great story that he's going to tell today about the Alabama connection with the Sultana disaster. So I have him come up, Jerry Potter.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a friend here that started the first grade with me all the way through 12th grade, and reminded me of the day that I got brought to the front of the class and my hand was slapped by the teacher. And I had forgotten about that. It was because I colored outside the lines. And I've been coloring outside the lines all for the rest of my life. Okay, I always try to focus my talk on a particular group. Y'all are from Alabama, so I actually wrote an article for the Alabama Heritage Magazine several years ago on the Sultana connection with Alabama, and there's a lot of connection. So we're going to get into it. We're going to start with September 1864. The war was not going well for the Confederacy. On September 1st, Sherman had captured Atlanta, probably one of the turning points of the Civil War, because it was Atlanta, the fall of Atlanta, that probably got Lincoln reelected in November of 1864, because there was great opposition developing in the North to the war by the Peace Democrats, also known as Copperheads, who wanted to make peace with the Confederacy because of the number of people that had been killed during the war. And it was when Atlanta fell that Lincoln really got the motivation. And Lincoln himself thought he was going to lose the election. But it was when Atlanta fell that Lincoln was able to win the election. Okay. Sherman was in Atlanta, in and around Atlanta. The Confederate Army, the Army of the Tennessee under General John Bell Hood, was retreating. They were pretty well demoralized. And behind Sherman was about 400 miles of railroads. This was Sherman's supply line that ran from Louisville, Kentucky to Atlanta through Nashville. When the railroads got to Nashville, there was an eastern branch, the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad, about 152 miles, and then there was the western branch with 3 different railroads that ran from Nashville to Decatur, Alabama. And what would happen would troops would be coming down south and supplies on this branch of the railroad and going to Atlanta. And then empty trains or trains with wounded would be on this leg, so they were able to have both north and south. But when it got to this point, it became a one-track railroad. So in Nathan Bedford Forrest, in mid-September 1864, the high command of the Confederate Army in the Western Theater decided that they needed to send Forrest to destroy this supply line, thinking that if Forrest did that, then Sherman would be forced to retreat back to Tennessee, and that would give the Army of Tennessee under Hood breathing room. So that's what, and this is the 3 railroads. From Nashville to Columbia, Tennessee was the Tennessee-Alabama Railroad. From Columbia to the state line of Alabama was the Central Southern Railroad. And then from the state line of Alabama to Decatur, it was the Tennessee-Alabama Central Railroad. And it would be this part of the railroad, the Tennessee-Alabama Central, that Forrest would be attacking in late September 1864. There was like 112 miles from Nashville to Decatur. At Decatur, Alabama, the Memphis-Charleston Railroad intersected this railroad, and I forgot to mention this, but earlier, this is the Memphis, right here, Memphis-Charleston Railroad, and it joined the West Railroad at Decatur, Alabama, and joined the Nashville, Chattanooga Railroad at Stevenson, Alabama, and this circle was really the key to Sherman's supply line. There was a fort at Athens, Alabama, and this is a configuration of the fort. The fort was under the command of a young Colonel Wallace Campbell, had been with the 12th Illinois Infantry before he took command of the United States Colored Troops. He was commanding, and these were the soldiers who were in Fort Henderson, which was in Athens. The 106th USCT, that's United States Colored Troops, 110th and 111th. These soldiers, these black soldiers, were former slaves from around the Pulaski, Tennessee area. That's where the units were organized, but also from the counties along the where Athens was located, Limestone County and surrounding counties. So they were local slaves that had joined the United States Colored Troops. And also were 124 members of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, which was a Union regiment organized near Knoxville, Tennessee. And this is the trestle over Suffer Creek. This is the creek. It was 300 feet long, 70 feet high, and it was actually north of Athens on the Tennessee-Alabama Central Railroad. And there was a fort located, this is the trestle here, there was a fort located here, and 2 blockhouses, wooden blockhouses on each end of the trestle to guard that particular structure. It was probably the longest wooden trestle on that section of the Nashville Decatur Railroad. And that is a wooden blockhouse. This was near Chattanooga on the Nashville Chattanooga Railroad. Normally that held about 30 to 40 soldiers. It was good. It was a good defense for small arms fire, but it was not good defense for artillery that the soldiers would later find out. And this is the fort. It was 300 feet by 300 feet. There were 2 12-pound artillery pieces, and it was under the command of this man, Lathrop, with 111th USCT. Also, second in command was a young Lieutenant Colonel Menace from 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. And also, Eli Lilly was with the 9th Tennessee Cavalry. He was the pharmacist who would later found the Eli Lilly Company that's still in existence. He was a major in command of the 9th Indiana Cavalry. And there were 1,000 men in the fort at Suffer Creek Trestle. You can see there was 900 African-American soldiers, not 400 with the African-American soldiers, 400 with the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, 200 with the Indiana Cavalry. Isaac Battles. He was a 22-year-old farmer from St. Clair County, Alabama. He was married, had 1 baby. He and his 3 brothers, William H. and William F. and James M. and a cousin, Russell, went to Nashville from northern Alabama and enlisted in the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. And they were actually in the fort at Suffer Creek Trestle. So, late September 1864, Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, with about 4,500 soldiers and 8 pieces of artillery, came out of Mississippi, northern Mississippi, and initially on the evening, late afternoon of September 23rd, 1864, his skirmishers encountered some of Colonel Campbell's troops, and there was a slight skirmish at that time. Campbell retreated back into the fort, and on the morning of September 24th, Forrest surrounded the fort and started using his artillery to bombard the fort. Mid-morning, Forrest sent a white flag and a message to Colonel Campbell: you need to surrender, because if you don't, the entire garrison will be wiped out. Now, this was a few months after Fort Pillow, so his words probably had great effect on Campbell, but initially Campbell said no. But then Forrest said, well, come and inspect my forces. And so Campbell did with another officer. And Forrest did what he did many times. He played a trick on this young colonel. Campbell saw a group of infantry men march by, and then he saw a group of mounted cavalrymen ride by. Then he saw another group of infantry march by, and what Campbell didn't know, they were the same men. He saw pieces of artillery keep coming by, and so by the end of the inspection, Campbell was convinced there was 12,000 Confederate soldiers under Forrest's command, and there were 24 pieces of artillery. So Campbell surrendered. And as the flag is going down, a relief column was making its way towards the fort and actually saw the flag drop. And about that time, they were close enough to the fort that the Confederates surrounded the relief column under the command of Colonel Elliott, and there were 378 soldiers from the 102nd Ohio Infantry and the 18th Michigan Infantry that made up this relief column. They were surrounded. The Confederates started firing, and these are some of the 18th Michigan Infantry soldiers, and these are some of the 102nd Ohio Infantry. Of the relief column, 106 of them were killed or wounded. The fort, only one soldier was killed, one soldier was wounded. So after Forrest captured the fort at Athens, he then moved up the railroad to Sulphur Creek Trestle. And he arrived, this is the fort, again, 300 feet. And these are some of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry soldiers who were actually at the fort. And these are some of the 9th Indiana soldiers at the fort. The problem was this. The fort was here. Captain John Morton, who was Forrest's commander of artillery, placed his artillery pieces on hillsides in this area that was actually a higher elevation than the fort. So actually, and there were sharpshooters placed along these higher elevations. So when the morning came, the artillery started firing. He was quickly killed. The men fought as long as they could. 107 of them were killed in the fort. 50 of them were wounded. The 2 artillery pieces were destroyed. They were out of ammunition. Their leader was killed, so they surrendered. So 569 black soldiers were captured, and 1,731 white soldiers were captured on September 24th and September 25th. The black soldiers were sent to Mobile, Alabama, to work on the fortifications around Mobile Bay. The white soldiers ended up marching to Corinth, to this area, placed on a train, And then when they got to Corinth, they went on the Mobile, Ohio Railroad down to Marion, Mississippi, and then by train over to near Selma, Alabama, to Cahaba Prison. Cahaba Prison was a small prison that had been built on a partially constructed brick cotton warehouse on the Alabama River. Over the course of the prison, there were approximately 5,000 prisoners there, many of whom were captured in northern Alabama. Only 147 died while it was in operation, mainly because it had very good water and it had a very compassionate commander, Henderson. Andersonville, in comparison, 45,000 prisoners, almost 13,000 prisoners died, mainly from bad water. The water was polluted because the Confederate Guard camp was upstream of the main water supply for the camp. So most of the men died from diarrhea and dysentery, as well as scurvy, lack of vitamin C. So in February, March, and early April, the Confederate forces started sending prisoners from Andersonville and Cahaba to a parole camp 4 miles east of Vicksburg, Mississippi, known as Camp Fisk. In mid-April 1865, there were approximately 5,500 prisoners located at that parole camp. The plan was General Dana, the commander of the Department of Mississippi, ordered that 1,000 men, after the exchange had been worked out, 1,000 men be placed on each privately owned steamboat and sent upriver to Cairo, and then by train from Cairo to Camp Chase, Ohio, where they would be mustered out of the Union Army. While they were there, the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated, and the Sultana. There's 2 known photographs of the Sultana. I found this one at the Mercantile Library or Museum in St. Louis. This is an early photograph of the Sultana taken at St. Louis waterfront. The Sultana was 260 feet long and had a legal carrying capacity of 376 passengers. Remember that number. It was Captain J. Cass Mason was not only the master of the captain, but also was part owner. When he and a group of investors had bought the boat, he owned a 3/8 interest in the Sultana. But by mid-April 1865, he had sold off everything but a 1/16 interest. He was a man in financial trouble that needed to make as much money as he possibly could on the next few trips up and down the Mississippi River, because he knew that after the war had ended, the lucrative contracts that he and the other steamboats owners had enjoyed was going to end. So he was determined. So the Sultana left Cairo, steamed downriver. In fact, it was the first steamboat to go downriver after Lincoln was assassinated, and actually carried the news of Lincoln's assassination with her downriver to Vicksburg, to Memphis, to Vicksburg, to New Orleans. The boat docked in Vicksburg, and waiting on the riverfront was this man, Captain Reuben Hatch, the villain. We finally figured out, I knew that was his photograph, but it took us probably 30 years to identify that as being Reuben Hatch. Early in the war, he had been arrested at Cairo. He was an assistant quartermaster general under Grant, and he had been caught taking bribes and stealing from the government. The evidence was overwhelming of his guilt. Grant ordered Hatch to be court-martialed, but he was never court-martialed. And this is why. This is a photograph of when Lincoln made the trip to talk to McClellan. And this is Lincoln. This man right here with the light-colored top hat is O.M. Hatch, the brother of Reuben Hatch. O.M. Hatch was Secretary of State for the state of Illinois, was Lincoln's personal friend, and was Lincoln's chief financial supporter. So O.M. Hatch, the governor and the auditor, wrote a letter to Lincoln, and Lincoln sent this endorsement. I also personally know Captain R.B. Hatch and never before heard anything against his character. If the judge advocate has the means of doing so, I will thank him to give me his opinion of this case. That's from the president. But the president didn't stop there. He appointed a three-man civilian commission to investigate the charges against Reuben Hatch at Cairo. Two of the three commissioners were from the state of Illinois, where Reuben Hatch was from. Guess what happened? The three commissioners concluded that Reuben Hatch was nothing more than an honest man. All charges were dismissed. Fast forward to January of 1865. Reuben Hatch is ordered to appear before an investigating or a testing commission board in New Orleans to be tested on his knowledge as to the requirements of an assistant quartermaster general. After being tested, the board said that of all the men tested, none was as deficient as Reuben Hatch, either because of mental disability or negligence. Was this man allowed to serve as an assistant quartermaster general? 2 weeks later, he was promoted to the chief quartermaster for the Department of Mississippi and sent to Vicksburg. Reuben Hatch met with John Clark Mason, J. Cass Mason, at the riverfront. And at the riverfront, they agreed that for his upriver trip, Reuben Hatch would give Mason a large load of prisoners. And in return, Mason would give a kickback to Hatch, which is exactly what he had done in Cairo and got away with it. So both left Vicksburg, and Captain George A. Williams. Originally, he was the officer at Vicksburg in charge of the prisoner exchange. He was a West Point graduate, class of 1852, had been in the military since graduating from West Point, and was still a captain, while most of his classmates were generals. He was a crook. He was, in 1863 and 1864, he was in Memphis. He was in command of the military prisons at Memphis, and he came up with an extortion ring or scheme. If you had a friend or relative in one of the military prisons, if you paid him, you could get him out. The military made a surprise inspection of the urban block prison in downtown Memphis, and the conditions, and he was in command of this prison, were so horrible that he was kicked out of the military. But he was a West Point graduate. Another West Point graduate by the name of General U.S. Grant came to his aid, wrote a letter, and for some reason he was exonerated, and I'm sorry. He was exonerated and sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi. And in mid-April, Williams had been ordered ordered to Cairo to communicate with the officials in Cairo about the prisoner exchange. And so Frederick Speed agreed to take over the role of being in charge of the prison exchange. So the Sultana left Vicksburg, stayed in New Orleans, left New Orleans with about 70 civilian passengers. About 10 hours south of Vicksburg, the middle larboard boiler developed a buckled area and steam was escaping. So the chief engineer had to reduce the steam pressure and was slowly making its way towards Vicksburg. when, while it was coming upriver, 2,000 prisoners were sent on the, 1,300 on Henry Ames. The Olive Branch took 700. The Sultana arrived in Vicksburg shortly after the Olive Branch had left. Two things happened when the boat docked at Vicksburg. First, the chief engineer went into Vicksburg to find and found R.G. Taylor, a local boilermaker, and he was brought on the steamboat, the Sultana, to look at the leaking boiler. He looked at it and said it's going to take several days to repair, and if he wasn't allowed to do a complete repair job, he wanted nothing to do with the boat. So he walked off the boat. For some reason, he came back on the boat and ended up, for the next 20 hours, placing a very thin patch over the buckled area, was not allowed to hammer down the buckled area before applying the thin patch. When he completed, he told the chief engineer the boiler was not safe. The chief engineer said, "Don't worry, we'll have it repaired when the boat reaches St. Louis." The second thing that happened, J. Cass Mason went into Vicksburg and talked to Speed. Speed told Mason, I cannot place any prisoners on the Sultana because it's going to take me several days to prepare the paperwork in time to place the soldiers on the steamboat, and I know you're not going to wait for 3 or 4 days. Mason was furious. He went to see his buddy Reuben Hatch, but later on the evening of April 23rd, George Williams returns from Cairo. This is one of the critical points of the story. It was Williams that told Speed, "Look, you don't need to prepare the paperwork in advance. You can place all the remaining prisoners at the parole camp on the Sultana tomorrow, and after they go upriver, you can prepare the paperwork later." Originally, Speed refused. Finally, he agreed, thinking there were only 1,300 to 1,400 prisoners remaining. Actually, there were closer to 2,000. So the next morning, Williams and Speed rode by train the 4 miles to the parole camp. It was agreed that Williams would ride on the first trainload of prisoners to the dock and be in charge of counting the men as they boarded the Sultana. And Speed would stay at the parole camp and be in charge of placing the men on the on the trains. Williams counted the men from 2 trains. What he didn't know was while he was at a saloon around noon, a middle train arrived, and so instead of being 2 train loads, there were actually 3 train loads. The men were from West Virginia, Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky. There were a total of the men captured in northern Alabama on September 24th and 25th. There were 710 of those soldiers on the Sultana placed at Vicksburg. This is actually on the riverfront. It's a painting, beautiful painting, that shows the loading of the men. There were 2,136 people on a boat designed to carry 376. Ann Ennis, who was one of the passengers, civilian passengers that got on the boat at Vicksburg, along with her husband, Harvey, and their child, Belle. She got on the boat with her husband and child, and she said, you can see, pointed out to my husband and myself, the sagging down of the hurricane deck, in spite of extra supports, which were placed in a great many places, the boat was very much crowded. The first clerk told one of the prisoners that if the boat made it safely to Cairo, it would be the largest number of passengers ever carried upriver on a single steamboat. Ann Ennis, her first 2 husbands had drowned. They were English sea captains. So she moved to Wisconsin thinking probably it was about as far as the ocean as she could get. Harvey and her child would drown and she would survive. She would never remarry. The boat docked on the morning of April 26, 1865 at Helena, Arkansas. And this is the last known famous photograph of the Sultana. When the men heard there was a photographer on the west side of the bank, they all rushed to the one side of the boat, and the boat almost capsized. It had about 100 mules and horses, and several tons of cargo, including hogsheads or barrels of sugar. The boat left Helena, Arkansas, steamed to Memphis, arrived at around Memphis around 6 p.m., stayed here until about midnight, and then steamed up the river just a short distance to near the mouth of Wolf River on the east bank of the Mississippi River, where it took on 1,000 bushels of coal. Okay, let's set the stage for the disaster. This is Memphis. We're about right here. This is Mound City. The Sultana, now today the river goes this way. In 1865, the river actually went northwest from Memphis. Davis Lake, that you can see from I-40, was the hope-filled channel of the Mississippi River. When the boat was around this area, around 2 a.m., the river's at flood stage. This part of the river is probably 3 to 4 miles wide. It is slight rain. Most of the men are asleep. There's 76 life preservers and 2 small lifeboats for almost 2,200 people. At 2 a.m., disaster occurred. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded with a volcanic eruption. Actually, this is inaccurate in the sense that these smokestacks actually collapsed. One went this way, one went that way, crushing a lot of the people on the boat. Within 20 minutes, when the explosion occurred, it blew the pallet off the boat, the pallet house off the boat. The decks that were so overloaded and they had put the additional supports collapsed like a house of cards, trapping hundreds within the wreckage. And survivor after survivor tells stories of how horrible it was to hear their comrades screaming while they were burning alive, and how it was finally better when they finally stopped. The boat started drifting downstream. When the sun rose, there were 1,169 people dead, which was still the largest inland maritime disaster in American history. 55% of the people on the Sultana died. It is truly a blessing that the boat exploded north of Memphis instead of south of Memphis. Many of the survivors were actually rescued at the riverfront at Memphis. The soldiers who had been captured in northern Alabama, 385 died. The Judge Advocate General, actually the Secretary of War, ordered that George Williams, Reuben Hatch, and Frederick Speed be court-martialed because of placing so many men on the one boat. Only Speed was court-martialed. And he was found guilty and sentenced to be dishonorably discharged from the Union Army. The Judge Advocate General, Joseph Hope, reviewed the transcript like I have and concluded that really Speed had played only a minor role. It was really Hatch and Williams that played the major role. So he overturned the conviction, and Speed was allowed to honorably be discharged from the Union Army. He stayed in Vicksburg. If you go to Vicksburg today, you'll see Speed Street, named after Frederick Speed. He became a politician, an editor, and a judge. There are 12 graves at the National Cemetery of soldiers who were captured in northern Alabama. 12. Remember, there were about 1,100 soldiers that died. There's actually only 28 graves at the National Cemetery that I've been able to identify as men who died on the Sultana. Isaac Battle, if his body was recovered, it was buried along with hundreds of men in the National Cemetery with headstones that simply state, unknown U.S. soldier. To kind of give into comparison, the USS Arizona was destroyed December 7, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. 8 more people died on the Arizona than on the Sultana, but nobody knows about the Sultana. And that is the Alabama connection with the Sultana story. Any questions? I just made all this up. Now look, don't tell any stories.
I've got another story that's so neat. Can you tell them the story about Sam and Jean Lottridge in Humboldt, Tennessee, and how you helped solve the mystery?
Sam was a lawyer, I guess he still is. And I had a case, I was defending an accountant in Gibson County, my home county. And so I went to Sam's office and I got talking to his wife. And his wife said, you know, I had an ancestor who was a soldier, a Civil War soldier. So, you know, well, what was his name? And so I started researching. And I think I had a copy of my book. And I said, you know, he was actually on the Sultana. I said, you need to read this.
Yeah. She was from East Tennessee, and Sam lived in the Humboldt area. And Sam had a big Confederate flag over his desk. And Jean had, I don't know, was it a U.S. flag, some kind of flag in her office. But she was from East Tennessee, and Sam was from West Tennessee.
And her ancestor was the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. Now, there was another man from Milan who came to me one day and said, look, I had 2 great-great-great uncles who were on the Sultana, and they were Confederate guards. And I said, well, there weren't any Confederate guards. Yeah, they had been guards at Andersonville, and so they had gotten on the boat at Vicksburg, and they were guarding the prison. I said, no, there were guards on the Sultana, but they were Union guards. There weren't any Confederate. Well, they were Confederate. I said, what unit were they with? They were with the 7th Tennessee Cavalry. I said, well, they were with the 7th Tennessee Cavalry U.S. No, they weren't. Well, I researched it, and I sent them a letter saying, look, here's your military records of your ancestors. And, oh, by the way, they were Union soldiers. Never heard anything from them.
But the neat part is that Jean never knew where he was. And he was buried, wasn't he buried up in Illinois? Didn't they take some up there to bury? He wasn't buried in the Memphis area. But that was a neat story.
I don't remember, but I remember that. And that has happened. You know, that's one of the great blessings that I've had over the years of helping people find out about their genealogy. A lot of people didn't know. You think about it, there were almost, 2,000 prisoners, and a lot of them survived. How many children, descendants come from those people? I've actually met 8 people whose fathers were on the Sultana. They're all dead now. But I mean, it's like, are you pulling my leg? You mean your father fought in the Civil War, survived the Sultana? Yeah, I can tell you stories. And Samuel Jenkins was a soldier from the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, and Miss Green, Glenda Green, wonderful lady, she's dead now, but that was her father. And she told me that, Samuel Jenkins was blown off, maybe kin to you, by the way, was blown off the boat, injured his shoulder. He goes, ends up in the hospital in Memphis, and like, I'm not about to get on another steamboat. He walked from Memphis to Maryville, Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee. That's what, 400 miles? And had a child at 75 years old. It was like, those were men back then.
How old was
She was,
the mom?
Miss Miss Green.
The one who had the baby at the 7-year-old.
Oh, you mean Anne? Which one?
Well, he fathered a child at 70. So
Oh, yeah.
how old was his wife?
Very young. This was a second marriage. They were all second marriages. Very young wife. Probably to get the pension. Anyway.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
But it's, but they could, and Miss Green, she said, when I was a little girl, I can remember a time when my father was sitting in front of the fireplace and he was real quiet. And I said, Dad, what's wrong? And he said, I can still hear the screams, and there wasn't anything that I could do. These men were haunted by what they went through for the rest of their lives. In fact, I'm giving a talk in June in Wichita, Kansas. So it's the Kansas connection with the Sultana. And there's a connection. But I've researched two particular soldiers with the 115th Ohio. One soldier, both of them survived, Andersonville survived the Sultana. One went to work for the railroad and was struck by lightning and killed. I mean, that's just... Another one committed suicide on a street corner somewhere, later in life. A lot of these men died young, those that survived. They didn't last long. Any questions? Well, thank y'all.
Thank you.
Well, folks, I'm Alan Ruzicka. I'm up from Huntsville, Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable. One of the things that we wanted to do when we came up here is kind of pass along some of the funding that we kind of gathered. But I should tell you a little story about this. And thank you, Mr. Potter, for this. Is great. We're going to try to convince him to come back up or come down to Huntsville and do this for us for our Civil War Roundtable. It's good to see Dr. Fields here, a friend of our Civil War Roundtable. It brings General Grant to life for us, and we always appreciate his time. But so this person, a representative that you know very well, Judge Fogelman, came down and gave us a Sultana lecture down to our Civil War Roundtable. Now, some of us knew about the Sultana, but it brought it to heart. And then to know that there was a museum, one, that there's going to be another museum, a new one, well, we got excited. And it just so happens we were trying to decide what we were going to do for our 2024 donation. So we pass along this bucket every meeting. We call it the battlefield bucket. And we stuff some money in it. And at the end of the year, we give that money to a deserving Civil War cause. So Judge Fogelman inspired us. And like 2 weeks later, it took us about 15 seconds to determine that we were going to give our funding for 2024 to the Sultana Disaster Museum. So with that, Jeff, if I could get you to come up. We collected, now this isn't like FedEx money, but it is a lot for us. $2,345 for us this year, and we like this. We expect probably after Mr. Potter's presentation, if I could convince him to come back in 2026, we'll probably be able to bring you some more.
That would be great.
So thank you very much. And thank you. One more.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks to your group. Yes, it's not FedEx money, but it's all the same color. We can spend it the same. But, I'm sure most of you know that museums like ours, yes, we've had some larger donations that have helped us acquire that building and will help us build our exhibits. But it's donations like this that are going to keep the lights on and keep people hired and keep programming like this going and so on and so forth. So becoming a member, becoming an annual donor, all those things are going to be super important for us and those programs to develop. So thank you, Alan. Thanks to your group. Thanks to you guys for coming up today. Let's give another round of applause to them. I feel like when I'm around you, I just want to sit in the back and just throw out states. Just like Montana, connect Montana to the Sultana. Anyway, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah.